when I talked to Martin about doing this a long time ago, I wanted to do something more hands-on because I didn't want to create another presentation. And I think Jenkins and Garrett is what I'm going to be talking about. Primarily Jenkins, though. It's something that's sufficiently simple that it's much easier just to dive in and play with it than it is to talk about it and take screenshots, etc. How many people have VirtualBox here? Okay. Do you also happen to have Ruby installed? Okay, this will be a little bit more difficult then. So for, yeah, this will be a lot more difficult. So for the, like, to package up a good base starting point, I've used a tool called Vagrant, which I've created. If you look in the boxes directory under here, and I'll just so under boxes, there's these two boxes. One is Jenkins with RVM. Now, I'm a Ruby developer by trade, so most of my stuff is going to be Ruby related. But if you grab Jenkins with RVM, if you've got Vagrant and VirtualBox, this will be very easy for you. If you don't have Ruby or Vagrant or VirtualBox, this will be very difficult. But I've got a plan B for those of you that don't, if you still want to follow along. If you go up to the root directory and just grab jenkins.war, I'm presuming everybody has Java installed here. So if you have Vagrant, great, that's what I'm going to be starting from. If you don't and you still want to follow along, just grab jenkins.war and pull it down. And if pulling stuff over Wi-Fi from my laptop starts to really suck, I've copied all of this onto 3 flash drives, and I can pass those around if that doesn't work as well. They are laden with malware, though.
It will take 6 hours to download.
Yes, let's just. Okay, so is it safe to assume that everybody kind of knows what Jenkins is? Yes? Okay, so I'm going to skip some of that. I'm not. Let me go back. So I use Jenkins in just about everything. I've used it in a production cluster. I've used it locally. John Willis in the other room was just talking about using Rundeck with Jenkins to automate some operations tasks. So yeah, in this session I want to cover a couple things. Who I am doesn't really matter, blah, blah, blah. I just want to go through Jenkins for those of you that haven't seen it before. And this is all going to be interactive, me walking through this stuff. And kind of doing some basic tasks with Jenkins. All the way to, so I work at Lookout. I skipped over that part. But I work at Lookout, and we deliver a mobile client for Android, iOS, formerly BlackBerry and Windows Mobile, but no one cares about those anymore. But we also have a very large web and security component that need to be shipped very quickly. And so we use a combination of Garrett and Jenkins and these sort of staircase pipelines to ensure quality as we try to ship on a day-by-day basis. So going through creating these sort of pipelines to, I don't know, were you all here for Jez's talk yesterday? A lot of you were here? The diagram that he talked about in terms of going from developer to unit testing to more deep acceptance testing and all the way down. You can set that up in his tool of choice, Go, but you can also do it in Jenkins pretty easily, so we'll go through that. And then the really meaty part is using Garrett and Jenkins together. So Garrett is a Git-based code review tool that acts as a Git repository. So if you aren't familiar with Git, it's a decentralized version control system. So you can have multiple repositories running around on your network or on anybody's network, etc. Garrett can actually act as one of those Git repositories. So at Lookout, for example, we use Garrett as as the upstream repository where everyone is pushing to, and that is kind of the golden source of any of our source code. But we coupled it with Jenkins, which allows you to do pre-tested commits. So you can push changes to Garrett, get them tested, get them code reviewed. And after all that's done, then it can be integrated into the mainline repository, pulling that feature out or whatever you're working on for the rest of the developer team. No. Linux! Well, this will be extra super difficult. Really?
Can you toss one back here?
They're all beat bad. Almost certain they're not, or they're beat bad. Well, that's fun.
Yeah. At the end of the day, people like to install still follow along. Yeah, just make it available somewhere online and follow along.
Oh yeah, they're all. I'll throw up some links later. Before I came, I uploaded them both to Space. So not on this wireless network, but on another one.
What do I need to grab from here?
Do you have Vagrant?
I do.
You want to just grab in the boxes directory? Just grab with RVF.
All right.
Thanks. So I'm going to go ahead and start. This is Vagrant. Vagrant, if you're not familiar with it, at DevOps Days about 4 or 5 months ago, Patrick Dubois introduced me to Vagrant, and I've started using it ever since. It's a really clean way to couple Puppet manifests and chef recipes with a virtual box image. So we actually use it a lot at Lookout to just bring up an entire development stack on a local workstation and have this sort of base image, and that's what these boxes are for, this common base image that we can then all build on top of. So I've just created a simple Vagrant file, and I'm just going to use this imported Jenkins with RVM box that I really wish I could share. I know it's bringing that person. Are they working for anybody?
Yeah, I was able to get it, but I've got Linux on here.
Okay. Really? I was fairly certain I just formatted them top 32. Awesome. Okay.
Why not?
Well, that's a lot. Can you guys get Jenkins.war at least? That'll at least get us something. You were able to get Jenkins.war? Okay.
Anybody else?
I meant from my workstation.
Your machine. It was going to take 6 hours for the virtual box, and then 1 hour for the
WAR file.
For the WAR file. So
you can just go to.
Yeah, it's kind of the downside about wanting to do workshops or demos with this stuff. Is Jenkins by itself is 37 megs, Garrett's 25 megs of a WAR file, and then the base box that I actually built on top of is it's distributed by the Vagrant project. It's the Lucid 32 base box. It's 400 megs.
So you don't have anything on top of that? I have that.
You have that?
Yeah, you want it?
Yes, but you would need to grab Jenkins.war.
Well, I'll wait.
Okay.
Anybody else want to try the USB drive?
Sure.
forth.
Anybody Linux?
No, this is actually just fact critical.
So that one is the correct one.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, do you have any
Yeah.
I just completely thought of that.
So there's at least one stick that works. Okay, well, for the one guy who's got the Baker, I'm starting with RVM. Just created a simple Baker file that's mapping port 8080 out, which is for Jenkins, and then just bringing that online.
You got the wrong port. You typed 883 into
Yeah, I mapped it out to 8080. They've already got something else on 8080. And a little wireless. I might have been over ambitious. Okay, so this network really does screw some of things. Okay, Git repositories, I've got all this stuff ready. Well, I'm going to forge ahead, pretending like you all can follow along. So the first thing, this is Jenkins installed from a native package. We've got now native packages for Windows, OpenSolaris, Gentoo, Ubuntu, Debian, OpenSUSE, Fedora, Red Hat, Enterprise, and a couple others, if there's anything left after that. But so I've installed a native package, and that pulls everything under and that the native packages, including the Windows one, I believe all start up Jenkins under port 8080 on your local host. So the Jenkins setup, I'm just going to create a little simple Hello World gem builder. Unfortunately, if you're not a Java shop, some of the job integrations aren't as clean. If you use Maven, for example, Jenkins works very, very well with Maven, integrating everything kind of together. But this is a Ruby project, so we'll just do shell scripts. So this is the configuration view in Jenkins. It's all the more plugins you add to Jenkins, the more cluttered and confusing this all gets. And so this is actually pretty bare bones and basic as far as the Jenkins configure page goes. There's just a few plugins that I've added to this build. The parameterized build plugin lets you throw parameters in when you invoke the job. The Git plugin, because we're going to be using Git, and a couple other things. So I'm going to grab my gem. So are there any other Ruby developers here with some level of familiarity? Okay, a couple. So I'm going to be using a tool called RVM, so we can isolate the gem building and its installing for this particular job. You can do similar things with Python and virtualenv. I'm not sure what Java offers for sandboxing builds, the same with Tomcat. I'm going to cheat and copy what I already have. Which is a little bit of boilerplate to kind of pull in RVM. In most cases, you aren't going to need to do the boilerplate in every build step. What's really important here is that, in this case, I'm just calling gem build on this gem spec, which is just going to, I'm not running any tests, I'm not invoking anything. I just want to make a build, which for gems is typically just zipping something out. And that's it. That's all I want to do right now is just build a gem. That wasn't me. It's my fault. Yeah. And it failed. Ah. So, I don't know, I turned it off first.
Oh, you turn it off.
Yes. I mean, everyone can hear me.
Can you guys hear in the back?
Yeah.
I'm using my outside voice. So this failure is actually, I could speak for 2 hours on the problems we have with the Git plugin. Git, unfortunately, is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's not as simple as Subversion, for example, in that a lot of people who work with Git will use it in a number of different ways. So the Jenkins Git plugin is overly complicated. There's a lot of technical debt that's been accumulated, and this is one of those pieces of technical debt. By default, Jenkins wants to try to tag every build in its local Git clone, which, to be honest, I don't know why it's there, but it's not useful to us. And fortunately, the Git plugin offers a plethora of options. To give you an idea, these are all Git plugin options.
Holy
And I'm just going to skip the internal tag, which is the only option I care about right now. And I'll try this build again. This build succeeded. If you are using RVM, unfortunately RVM is a lot of bash scripting and other things, so when you pull it in, it's going to dump out a lot of information to the console.
Yep. So by default, it's just running as your user account with like your login shell.
When you use the native packages, for example, on Ubuntu, it'll create a Jenkins user under no group, and the home directory will be varlib Jenkins. And so all jobs by default that are executed on this master, which is the only Jenkins slave up and running right now, will be executed as that user. You can do some interesting things with bringing up. I've brought up multiple slaves on the same host as different users to achieve more isolation if I've got user processes on that host. But right now it's just running as Jenkins on the same. Lots of RVM boilerplate. All the way down here, there's just a successfully built my Ruby gem. What they do. Which really is just a zipping up of the Ruby gem. So if you aren't using Maven, for example, and you don't have a native build step in here, or if you've got Ant or Maven, then you've got a build step you can use. Any command that returns a non-zero exit code in your shell script will cause the build to fail. So if I just put a false up here before I invoke the gem build, the build's going to fail at that point and not run any of the rest of the code. The wireless went down again for me, and I'm cloning from my wireless address, so I'm going to change that real quick. It'll work the build, which fails it, unfortunately. I'm going to switch this to a local. And that can get in. Not that can get in. Alright, so that's the basic setting up a simple job. I'm going to switch to a different machine that's a little bit more set up, because this one is not helping my cause. Well, that's good. I'm going to grab a water real quick. Sorry, nothing will make you sweat like everything in your demo failing. But it's all pretty simple. I could probably go off of all of this just from my own familiarity with Jenkins. It's also a very simple tool, so it's not difficult to find out just about anything you want. If you go to wiki.jenkins-ci.org, we've got a lot of tutorials for every single plugin on how to use it. Typically, there's a lot of screenshots for the popular plugins. There's just a lot of good documentation built around it. But at its heart, it's a pretty simple and straightforward tool. Jenkins getting ready to work. The reason that we keep seeing this, by the way, is Jenkins stores everything in XML files on disk. There's no MySQL backend store. There's no SQLite backend store. It's all serialized objects in Java written to disk, which has its pros and cons. Pros, the guys from Puppet can drop a WAR file into Tomcat very easily. The cons is, if you've got a slow virtualized disk, then this part takes a little while. A little more than a little while. Alright. So I've also got in this other machine that my finished product, like on the cooking shows where they're making things and then they pull the finished thing out of the oven. This machine is everything pulled out of the oven. So this is the same project, building that same gem, but I've added a couple of extra things to it that I'm going to use to fit into my continuous delivery pipeline. For one, I'm pulling source control. If you are using Subversion or if you are using Git, there are typically better ways to do this than pulling source control. Both Subversion and central Git repositories let you invoke a hook every time commits are sent along. That's typically a lot lighter weight on your Jenkins instance to do than having everything pull every minute, which can bog down the machine a little bit. But because we're not running much, we're just pulling from SCM, blah, blah, blah. Or creating that same build step, but we've got some other post-build actions here. These are, if you use Java, these come in a lot more handy. Archiving the artifacts, typically if you've got jars or WAR files, archiving those, you can then push those to a Maven server. In our case, I don't have a local gem repo, so I'm just going to archive all the gems. And I'm also going to build these other projects, which is the start of this sort of pipeline of jobs. And the reason that I want to do this pipeline of jobs is, for this project, everything's very, very simple, but if I'm running unit tests, functional tests, Selenium tests, coupled with an actual build process, then coupling all of this stuff together in one large job means that job takes forever, and if it fails, you've got to go through everything all over again. If you tier things out and build another project, this one is our builder project, the next one down is the tester project. If the build fails, no big deal, we'll just rebuild. If the test fails, I can just restart that test job. And so you can, by creating this sort of pipeline, you can restart any point further down the chain in that pipeline if you need to, and you can say here, it just takes 48 hours is what they do for the test. You don't have to do the whole 48 hours every single time. I'm also recording the fingerprints to track the file usage. This is a feature built into Jenkins to where it will just, anytime you archive artifacts, you can tell it to fingerprint them, which is just an MD5 file. And then you can get an idea of where those files have been used in what other jobs. I'll show you that. So I've got these two. So I've got two successful artifacts from the most recent job, job 10. Hello version 1 and hello version 2. And I've also got fingerprints for these guys. So with the fingerprints, I can actually tell what other jobs this has been used in. This one hasn't been used in anything. Oh, I know what. This one has been used in. It's actually the same artifact between these two builds, which means the gem didn't change between them. Let me open it up. So that's our builder. Any questions about, like, seriously, you guys, everything I plan to do has already gone to ship, so raise your hand and just ask questions really fast. or goblins and speakers.
So using the fingerprint plugin, it basically takes an MD5 of whatever your jar file is, whatever gem, and then if you pass it along to further on build steps, like Jez talks about with a testing and then an integration testing and blah blah blah, and then it'll let you know which other builds have pulled that particular gem jar.
It doesn't tell you what other builds have pulled it unless you explicitly. So I'm using a copy artifact plugin.
Okay.
Pretty much any additional stuff you want to do other than set up a cron to invoke a build step, there's an additional plugin for it. I think we're above 420 plugins at this point, which is a good thing, but also kind of a bad thing because it's difficult to find what you want. So this copy artifact plugin will pull in this gem, and I kind of need to re-artifact it and re-record the fingerprint. And the fingerprints use just, if you have artifacts from any job and they all have matching fingerprints for those artifacts, then they'll be linked together. With the copy artifact plugin or with any of the other ways you can pull artifacts in from other jobs, there's nothing inherent in Jenkins that'll say, oh, this is coming from hello gem, I'm pulling this into hello tester, I'm going to make a note of that. So you have to be a little bit explicit about it. Let's try to talk about that one. So that's pending. I'm going to go into my tester job, which doesn't really do much. It's some of the same boilerplate shell script stuff. But I create, if you're familiar with RVM, I create a local gem set for this specific job, so I've got an isolated sandbox for these gems. And then I install my gems in there, and then I run a little test script. And this is because I couldn't be bothered to do test units properly. So I'm just running the script. So while I was showing that, I started hello gem. And you can see Jenkins will also tell you which builds that this was started by and where its artifact came from. So it says this is started by the upstream project hello gem build number 11. And I'll also look at the fingerprint for hello version 2 gem. I'll see it's been used in hello gem build 11 and hello tester build 10. And so when you use this, if you have gems or sort of binaries of some form or fashion, in our case it's typically Debian packages or APKs for Android, fingerprinting and tagging those so you can kind of see where build number 111 is getting used throughout this pipeline is very, very useful. Parameterized jobs. Did I say Android? Alright, I'm going to change my hello gem job to be parameterized. And the parameterization is built into Jenkins by default. There's not an additional plugin. But there's actually something cool. It's the parameterized build aspect of Jenkins offers up an extension point that the copy artifact plugin uses. So some of these values are by default, some of them are inserted there by plugin. In this case, I'm just going to throw a screen parameter in. Call this guy new name. And then, so I created a parameter called new name, and then those parameters will be exposed into your, in this case, the shell build set as environment variables.
Hey, Tyler, can you just, for my own edification, can you repaint the big picture for me? Like, where are we going? And the goal is at the end of all this, we're going to have something. And now you're walking us through this process. That's like me knowing what the picture is going to look like. I think we're just something we connect before we go.
Sure. Let me.
I actually got a slide. I'm just finding it. So this is from the Garrett talk that I gave at the Jenkins conference. I'll get to the Garrett stuff later. But what's important is once changes are in this sort of upstream your canonical source control, just kicking off this waterfall of I'm going to mix with 20 minute course this pipeline of jobs to where at the end of this pipeline, after building and testing, we can actually run the deployment. And that's the really powerful part to me, is in some cases that might be pushing devs to a Debian repo or gens to a Ruby Gems repo. But getting all the way down this automated pipeline to where you can deploy straight out of Jenkins is kind of where I want to get.
Like checking upstream is like load up checking in Jenkins and you're pulling or just up to steady state, the changes to check in. Down the trigger release flow. You've got this chain waterfall code of trigger release test and then release deploy. So we're going to go through and see kind of release flow, how to do the release test portion.
Right. So, I don't know nobody back there could do that because I think these things yesterday. But it's just
Mike.
Alright.
Tell us more about upstream.
Right. So what Martin was pointing out is if you would picture this as trunk or your master branch in Garrett or what have you, code coming into this upstream repository will then start to kick off this pipeline by either subversion hooks or git hooks or polling SCM, and we'll start this entire automated process to go from build to test to deploy, all automated, to where if nothing passes, say build or test, that's where it ends. But if build checks out and your unit tests and integration tests check out, then in our cases, we actually don't do we don't do an automatic deploy. I'll show you how we can do a manual deploy straight from Jenkins. But we get to that deployment pipeline, or end of the deployment pipeline, and Jenkins can just kick off whatever steps you need to actually deploy your artifacts or your source code into production. Take a drink. So, for example, if you're using Git or Garrett, you can also accomplish this with TeamCity. I'm not sure what else is available in the Subversion world. You can get code through this. I'll come back to this. This is going to be confusing. So we've got our build and our tester jobs right now with this hello gem and hello tester builds or jobs, and they flow from one to the next. So now I'm going to actually create the release or deploy job that can be automatically kicked off of that. Unfortunately, because I have no wireless and nothing's working with the network, I'm not going to try to do any of that. I'm just going to stub it out, and we can look at it from there. Release. Build another freestyle project. So I'm going to trigger this after hello tester, which will put it at the bottom of that pipeline. So our order will be hello gem, hello tester, hello release. And so again, I'm just using the copy artifact plugin, and I'm just going to pull the gem from the upstream job from this, which for this job is going to be hello tester. And I think that's all I want to do thus far. So save this guy. I'll fire up hello gem. And now hello gem's in the build queue, that's going to run, and then it'll queue up hello tester and hello release. It's going so fast, it's not actually updating any of this stuff. Alright. So now hello release was built. And you see the upstream of hello release is a little low. Down here at the bottom was hello tester. And upstream from that was hello gem. Let me go back to the hello release. In this case, I'm not actually doing anything. There's plugins to do a secure copy. There's plugins to deploy to a Nexus repository. Just about, I think, any way that you would be deploying artifacts from your build, down to just invoking an rsync and calling a remote script, you can do in your release step. Right. So like I said, at Lookout, we don't actually do a fully automated deployment. Because there are mitigating circumstances we don't want to deploy. We haven't reached that nirvana that Des was speaking to. We can just deploy whenever there's no big major changes. We still have database migrations that occur, things like that. So we want to be a little bit more selective of when we deploy. So you can create a promotion criteria. And so Jenkins has this concept of promoted builds where if a build passes a certain criteria, you can invoke additional build steps, or additional actions, rather. So I'm going to say that this promotion, I'm only going to invoke it when it's been manually approved. And as part of that, I'm going to execute a shell that's going to just run echo deploy because there's not much else to really do without a network right now. There's a number of other actions you can do straight from the promotion process. You can use publishers. You can keep the build forever if you've got artifacts. You can archive these artifacts. You can build other projects. There's a lot of things that you can do from this sort of this promotion part. I can't think of a good way to. Promoted builds are not something that a lot of people are using right now. There's something that Java developers have used with Jenkins, formerly Hudson, for a long time. But I've started to use promoted builds as a means of controlling and guarding deployment. And then keeping the rest, ideally you get to the point to where your deployment, your test, everything is sufficiently automated and you're confident enough in that to where you wouldn't need to only promote when it's been manually approved. You could change it to promote immediately in this case, and just whenever this job succeeds, invoke the deployment part of this process. We'll stick to manually approved for now. There's not much to see here because it's going so quickly. Alright, so my second build is completed, obviously. And now I can come in and I can manually promote with the deployment criteria. And you see there's a manual approval, and in this case I'm just going to approve it, and it's going to start to run that promotion, the set of promotion steps that I had. In this case it was just the echo shell script. And it ran my big deployment that I just came up with. So using this sort of waterfall all the way down from the build test to that deploy job, you can still gate things without getting full automation and deploying to, say, production or your, I don't know what the equivalent would be for desktop development. But you can still gate that deployment. part? This is super boring or what? I was really hoping to walk through it. Alright, so. Oh, I should note one other thing. Note that this job has been promoted. So every build that you promote will have an icon next to it. So in this case, I deployed this particular build. So if you've got archived artifacts, and you can just come into Jenkins and see what's the last build that I deployed. And in this case, this was build number 2. In my Hello Gem, I actually already had this stuff set up. Oh, sorry.
Does the build pipeline tool use the idea of promotion? You just kind of put it optimization on it. I guess I'm trying to figure out whether it's turned on.
They are loosely coupled in that you can, building a pipeline is in Jenkins by default. There's no need for any promotion necessary. You can just say build this or these other projects after I complete this build, or once these other projects are completed, I should build myself. But with the promoted builds plugin, you can actually you can invoke other builds, and by the same token, you can say only promote if these upstream jobs have succeeded. So they aren't coupled by default, but you can if you want. In the case of this Hello Gem job, I already had some promotion criteria set up, which would automatically mark this gem as a release, or releasable, excuse me, and it just kept the build forever and did nothing else. But all of these jobs have artifacts that go with them that you keep forever in Jenkins that just mark these are releasable builds. Yeah, I've kind of been jumping around because none of the actual work templates work.
So because you are doing deploy to production from Jenkins.
We have a lot of different products we deploy. So I work on the server team. We actually have a security team that also manages some infrastructure in EC2 and elsewhere. They do deploys like this. On my team, we're a very large, organically exploded Ruby on Rails project. So we have a lot more difficulty automating a lot of these things in the same manner. But then there's other projects. What a lot of this actually came out of was one of the projects that I worked on with the CDAMon that we were deploying automatically to EC2. And so we use it in some places, but not every team or every project is as far along.
So how do you deal with security? Who can decide what gets promoted and
So we bind Jenkins to Active Directory. So we already have groups and some amount of security criteria involved. And so let's say, for example, from Hello Release, with this manual approval, you can actually specify who can approve it. And because this Jenkins demo doesn't have any authentication, there's no one to put it in. So you can actually specify both in the promotion build in general, but also in Jenkins the security settings. You can specify who can do what with the matrix-based authentication. For some of our projects, though, where we are using Garrett, Garrett offers a lot better ACLs on who can approve code and who can mark code as verified. So a lot of for a lot of those permissions we actually do in Garrett, where you say our team leads for this project are the only people who are authorized to integrate code into this repository. And so after that code's been integrated, after you've already signed off on it, then we can do the automatic part of the pipeline. But that's typically where we gate things, because if something gets all the way down to the bottom of the pipeline and we don't want to ship it for whatever reason because someone screwed up, then we've wasted a lot of resources doing that. So the further up you gate, the better I think. I'm going to go ahead and try to bring in Garrett now. Okay. just gonna run their plan myself. So, I don't know how well I'm doing on time. This is not going anything as planned. So, is there anything else I should cover on the Jenkins side of things before I move on to integrating Jenkins and Garrett? Right. We'll move on to Garrett. I'll use this again. So Garrett's just a simple code review tool, like I mentioned before, that integrates on top of Git. It allows you to do a couple things. It allows you to manually add reviewers to different changes, so you don't have this sort of amorphous pool of reviewers. You can explicitly call out people that should be looking at these changes. It also gives you, and if you've used a review board, this is pretty similar. It gives you the ability to create sort of inline comments on patches. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. And so everyone can leave their inline comments, and then they can also rate or give a specific change in Garrett a score. In order to be integrated into the repository, everything in Garrett needs to have a +1 verified, and in this case Leroy is my Jenkins account, and someone else will need to give it a +2. Well, I already went on with that. Okay. Oh, this would have been so useful before. So these points aren't additive, I should also mention. And it's something that's very easy to think when you start to really work with Garrett. So like I was mentioning to your question, you can create this rich set of ACLs. And so no one in this list of big people has the ability to give anything more than a +1, which means I think this is okay, but someone else who's got more authority or can speak to this better can approve this and integrate it. And then you can also leave comments on the change as a whole. Let's skip this. So I don't think I asked this before. Are there a lot of people using Git here already? A couple? Okay, so because Garrett integrates on top of Git, you can do some really fun things with Git and Git rebase. If you are using Git, you may be scared of rebase. Rightfully so, it's a very powerful tool. But because Garrett operates and integrates with Git, you can actually rework commits, and this is a little lower than it should be on the screen. But this particular change, let's say change 9, actually has 3 SHA-1 or 3 commit hashes that are identified with it. Which means I've gone through review once, either Jenkins failed it or someone on my team said I need to fix this. Then I went through and I did it again, sent my patch along. That also failed for whatever reason, to where you can group commits together, or iterations on a commit, excuse me, in a way that all of this code review and testing history is kind of preserved, and you get sort of a nice lineage of this patch evolving over time. Not sure how useful any of this is. Let me go ahead and bring up Garrett. So unfortunately, Garrett models some of its setup after Jenkins. So Jenkins, you can just run java-jar jenkins.war, and it'll set everything up for you and bring up Jenkins on 8080. Garrett tries to model after that somewhat, but it doesn't do everything for you. So I'm just going to create a really quick Garrett installation here on this base box. Yes.
So is it a standalone or it runs on top of the Jenkins?
It's standalone. So it's standalone, and like Jenkins, you can deploy it in another container. So Garrett was originally developed by a guy at Google, and they use it very heavily for the Android project. And in their case, they're running it, I believe, in Tomcat. But you can deploy it into just about any container. Development. Wow. Sure. They both try to choose port 8080 by default. So, kind of further along those lines, Garrett, unlike Jenkins, can also use a different backing store. So we've got Garrett using Postgres as its backing store for a lot of all the reviews and other metadata. You can set it up in what I did here by default to use H2, which is Java object store, and then it'll just persist those objects to disk. But it's a lot. I think it's a lot more flexible to kind of growing to very high usage than Jenkins. There's a lot of interesting talks a couple weeks ago at the Jenkins user conference from JBoss, or Red Hat now, and Yahoo about using Jenkins at scale. And there it's a little bit more of a hack, but Garrett was designed from the ground up to be used at multiple sites around the world, syncing and replicating between them, and scaling up to tens of thousands of developers. Because that was Google's use case was working with Motorola and Samsung and Sony Ericsson, etc. So it's a lot more growable, I think, out of the box. I'm going to bring down Jenkins. Let me bring this up real quick.
Like you didn't bring down Jenkins. You were starting.
Oh, I didn't bring down Jenkins?
You didn't start.
I'm not. So they both want to listen on port 8080, and I don't want to bring down the machine and bring it up again to remap that port. So there's no cheating for them on. So I'm going to go ahead and create the account.
So what we're
Normally-
going to be able to do is see the power of Garrett and Croy use.
Yes. So, yeah, I guess I will need to bring up Jenkins at the same time. I wanted to get a simple hash into Garrett and then get that tested with Jenkins. This also might be overambitious because some of this stuff didn't work out. I don't know what time it is.
It is
11:05.
45 minutes.
45 minutes to screw up.
Let's keep going.
Alright. So, give this guy whatever. And an SSH key. So, Garrett and Jenkins, I think, work best when you integrate them with SSH. The kind of default auth mechanism with Garrett is pushing over SSH for Git. With Jenkins, things become a lot easier, like bringing up additional slaves. When you just bring up additional slaves over SSH. If you're already deployed in EC2, for example, you can actually bring up slaves, have shared SSH keys, and have sort of an elastic build capacity there, which I won't go into, but I can tell you all about afterwards. So let me go ahead and So now with this user, I've just got a basic user, username, and an SSH key. So this user is set up, which means this user can now create or in this case, because this is my first user, it's the admin user, I can create projects and I can initialize initialize some of the stuff in here. And Garrett offers up an SSH API, actually. For a lot of things, you can do them through the web interface, but it's not as far along as Jenkins in that everything is configured through the web interface. There are some things like creating a project that you have to do from the SSH command line. Alright. So for time, I'm going to cheat really quick. And create. Okay. This was just to get a base level of Git repository setup. And because Garrett acts as a Git repo, I just wanted to give it what we've I just needed to initialize it with our existing history because we aren't creating this from scratch. So now, I'm going to create a change. Some of this is boilerplate stuff I didn't have prepared, so I'm just going through that real quick. I've got slides for my Garrett talk already posted, and there's a lot of good documentation on the Garrett Projects website on getting repositories, projects, users, everything initialized from the get-go. I haven't registered anything else. I should mention that the reason that I complained about that is because Garrett uses your email address on the commit message, which Git tags every commit you make with your username and your email address. He uses that combined with your SSH key to verify that you're the one that is pushing these changes. So you have some traceability of where these changes are coming from. I'm wondering if this would help me. The problem is it wants to actually try to send a mail to the SMTP server. So I'm going to cheat again and give myself super magic permissions. Author identity. There we go. You just have to give yourself admin access, and then you've got no problem. Alright, so I've got this simple change in here. This change ID is something that's dynamically generated by Garrett to kind of keep track of that change while you go through these multiple commits to kind of refactor and rework that change based on review. And it's just, there's not too much more I can say about this. It's a very simple and straightforward code review tool if you've used Review Board or something like it before.
Can you show what code you had at the time in my comment?
Yeah. So Garrett uses GWT, Google Web Toolkit, so it does a lot of fancy stuff in the browser, for better or for worse. So you just double click on a line. And you'll notice that everything shows up as a draft this far. And so the big stumbling block I had with my team when I introduced this to them is they would make all these comments and have lots of criticisms, and they left them all as drafts. So if you go up, see that there's a draft here, down at the bottom. And the way that you finally submit these changes, or submit these comments, is you actually review. and it'll tell you here are the inline patch comments that you've added, and then you can give an overall cover message. Give it a score rating, and then publish the comments. And when you publish comments, it's going to save your code review status here. It's going to send an email to the original developer saying, so-and-so has come along and told you, this patch is terrible, etc. Or on the flip side, if you have Jenkins testing things in here, or if you have people that come and say, this is good, I can integrate this now, you will also get, if you are the author of the commit, you will also get an email that says, so-and-so has approved your change, it's now been integrated. So now, we've got an inline comment that's been submitted. I fixed this, blah, blah, blah. That's the kind of basic flow from the developer side of things when working with Garrett. I think we can. Yeah. In the interest of time and watching me play up here, I'm just going to go to these slides about the Garrett trigger plugin, which is what I would use to integrate this Git pre-testing of commits with Jenkins for those changes that come into Garrett. The Garrett trigger plugin that operates inside of Jenkins actually opens up a long-running connection to Garrett over SSH. Garrett offers a SSH stream events API. So effectively, as soon as changes are submitted to Garrett, it'll write an event to that stream, and Jenkins will pick up on it and immediately queue whatever builds you lined up to be triggered based off this project. And inside of Jenkins, you can say, well, when I mark a build as successful, it should have a verified +1. This has been verified by Jenkins. You can also configure the code review values. You can say, instead of whether it's successful or failed, if you use Jenkins' test unit, or excuse me, JUnit test integration, there's this additional concept of an unstable build, which means the project was built, but some non-zero amount of tests are failing. You can customize the value of that. In our cases, any unstable build is rejected. All of our tests should be passing all the time, and if your changes are destabilizing things, we reject it outright at that code review. Which means we don't start that build, test, deploy pipeline at all with any failing tests. And if any of the tests are, this takes some discipline. If you get to the point where you're testing every commit and you see tests that are failing intermittently, either fix them or remove them. But not being able to trust your tests is a very big problem once you start to get into automating this deployment pipeline. So these slides, for example, and all this stuff is both published but documented under the Garrett trigger plugin. Because Garrett acts as an SSH repository, you can actually clone the project directly from it. Or because it acts as a Git repository, you can clone directly from it. Using some of these special tokens, which will, like I mentioned, the Git plugin is a lot of things to a lot of different people. So there's actually Garrett trigger integration inside of the Git plugin, so you can specify the Garrett rep spec and the Garrett branch, and this will just inform the Git plugin how to pull changes from Garrett. Because when you push things to Garrett, they don't go into the master branch by default, they go into a special other area where you can still access, but you need to inform the plugin how to do that. And then instead of having pull SCM, or this is triggered by a post receive hook in Git, or some hook in Subversion, you set up a new way of, a new build action that basically says for every, in this case, TPY clock, for every commit that is of project TPY clock that matches this wildcard, that matches a wildcard path, I want to invoke this job for it. And so I've actually used this to have multiple jobs that get triggered from the same criteria. Because there's no limit. You could have 10 different jobs that would be run for every single commit, which allows you, if you've got separate unit and functional tests, you can parallelize those out by just running them at the same time, triggered for the same job, or for the same change in Garrett. And then once they both complete, the Garrett trigger will actually join the results together. If there's any failures, it'll reject the patch. If there's all successes, then it'll give it a +1, and it's ready to go. So in the developer workflow, this is all figured out, but it would be, working locally in the kind of traditional Git sense, and then pushing those changes to Garrett, and having this verification job, say -1, +1, and then allowing whoever else is, your tech leads or whoever is responsible for integrating these changes into you can't see it behind the speaker, into the upstream golden repository. This one. And then from there you have additional jobs that you would set up to start running this pipeline. So I kind of went all over the place. I expected this to take a lot longer. So this is kind of all I had planned on talking about and showing. Is there anything I can answer about Jenkins or Garrett?
I was just wondering, it seems to me that this is nice for kind of encouraging developers to write tests, because the connection between your code and whether or not it actually has a test associated with it is tight, right? Like, you write the test, the code would be valued, and then it's testing stuff, and it becomes more obvious that
Right.
if you haven't written a test. That's just what I'm surmising, but have you seen in practice that this kind of pipeline does encourage the test to write the test for developers?
So I'll go into storytelling mode now. When I joined Lookout, I've been there about 6 or 7 months. We were using Pivotal Tracker and Subversion, and our code reviews were you would commit something to trunk, drop a link into Pivotal, and then bounce that story in Pivotal to someone else to review. And it's a very hodgepodge way of doing both code review but also testing. We also weren't using Jenkins at the time, which is something else entirely. What happened when we switched to Git, we kind of ripped the Band-Aid off all at once and switched from Pivotal to Jira with Greenhopper, which helped a lot. But we also switched from Bitten to Jenkins and from Subversion to Garrett. And the reason I say we switched from Subversion to Garrett is because we didn't introduce Garrett or Git as a separate tool. It was, here's how you interact with Garrett. And Garrett became the focal point of where development kind of converged. And what happened was we stopped slipping schedules, which was big, because we would slip a release every other week, which was frustrating. But it was also very apparent to everyone involved when you didn't write tests, for example. Because if you would go through the patch in Garrett and you would see changes to the files, you'd see changes to app models, whatever, blah blah blah. But you didn't see anything under the test hierarchy. And that's kind of the standard Rails. There's app, there's lib, and test, and that's where all the tests. You didn't see anything under that. You could almost immediately say, I'm not accepting this. Like, there's no tests involved. I can't verify that. I can't verify, but Jenkins also can't verify that this does anything it's supposed to. And so it made that sort of, by exposing things through Jenkins into the Garrett code review process, and by integrating any sort of really cohesive code review process, it became very apparent when people weren't writing tests and kind of cheating, but also when you simply cannot at Lookout integrate code that affects other people, i.e. comes into the upstream repository, that destabilizes the tree. It's not possible unless you find something that we haven't tested already, which has happened before. So the end result of that is that everyone involved is invested in these tests and making sure that they're there and present, because if something doesn't get caught by a test, and destabilizes that upstream repository, then everyone downstream has problems, and it wastes a lot of time. And so by doing all this stuff at once and by having this information very readily, like right in front of people, I work with very smart people, but we're all lazy to some extent. Kind of reducing that opportunity for laziness has changed a lot of the stability of what we're deploying into production. There's other ways that you could get even stricter about that, to where you could write a job in Jenkins that hooks into the Garrett trigger and says, if this change has no modifications to the test tree or the test hierarchy, I'm just going to reject it outright. And you can not even bother with any commits until someone's added tests to go with them. But you'd run the danger of people writing crap tests just to get their code in. But I don't think Jenkins and Garrett can solve people problems like that. Do you have a question?
You mentioned you were using Jira. I was just wondering, do you have any experience with Crucible, and how does that compare and contrast with Garrett?
So I've seen Crucible from afar. I've never had to work with it on a day-to-day basis. I don't know. Review Board is the only other real code review tool that I used prior to deploying Garrett. That is what Crucible is, right?
Yeah, it's cool.
I lose track of all the Atlassian products.
So do you still use Jira?
Yes. So there's of course there's a Jira plugin for Jenkins. There's not a plugin subsystem for Garrett, but we've coupled. We use Jira with Greenhopper to kind of do our agile 2-week iteration thing, and then Jenkins can actually tie into Jira, and when builds fail that reference a particular commit, you can update that ticket in Jira straight from Jenkins. But right now, there's not really a good way of integrating Garrett with some of those tools. We kind of just have the convention now to throw up comments in an issue with the code review link. And that's about it.
What does Jira bring to the table? Including the trackers, what you're helping with you have to really be on that.
So he's asking, what did Jira bring to the table that Pivotal didn't? The guys at Pivotal wrote Tracker for their specific use case, which I think works very well. But what we ended up happening, and if you've never seen Pivotal before, you've got kind of, here's stuff that I'm working on, Icebox, and another column. I don't even remember at this point what's in that other column. But what we started to see happen was we would lose track of older stories that were, we want to tackle this. They just get, our Icebox, I think, when we switched over was like 200 or 300 stories long. And so what would happen is we wouldn't search for some story we created 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago to do something. You just create a new story real quick and pull that into this iteration. It made things very difficult from the kind of, I don't think change management is the right phrase. This kind of the auditability of where blockers were and what was going on. Jira gave us a lot more flexibility when things were stalled in Garrett, when we were waiting on operations to provision new hosts in the data center. We would then be linking operation stories and blocking based on those. So from an engineering management perspective, it was a lot cleaner for us to figure out why we were stalled, if we were stalled, but also kind of when we would do our kickoffs every 2 weeks, we'd have a much clearer idea of where all the dependencies for any particular task were. So we use Greenhopper with, we do a lot of subtasks, and it just gave us a lot clearer picture of what we were doing on any given day. Oops.
Just a comment on the course of text. You can, that is what Raven
lifecycle choices. I'm sure there's other ways to, when you're using a lifecycle, decide on
Yes. No, I don't like to preach, and we don't actually do this either internally, but we use Maven for our build framework for most of our projects. And with respect to code coverage and test coverage, we're really bad about that. And although we haven't applied this, you can cause the package phase of Maven to fail if code coverage is in a certain percent, or if find bugs finds a whole bunch of terrible things. So Maven has given us a toolbox, though we're not using all the tools. It's nice to know that they're there, and if we got to a point where there was organizational adoption for test coverage and the time to write all the tests that we need to write, we could enforce it programmatically.
So that actually reminds me, there's let me bring up the violation for you. There's also ways built into Jenkins to fail builds based on you mentioned linting, which made me think of this. But this actually also works within the Garrett pretest commit context. If you use the violations plugin, you can use find bugs, you can use JS lints, Cafe for Python developers, and a lot of other things, to where you can actually configure based on how, like in where I've deployed this before, based on how many Cafe or Pylint errors came up. Like if you're just writing something that we can detect is immeasurably crappy Python code, then we can fail to build for that, or do things like that. So you see, you can report violations, and you can actually change the stability of the build based on those results. And so I've seen people with a lot of success using Copertura, I think that's how you pronounce it, for code coverage, coupled with the violations plugin, to where you can pull that information into your build or your test jobs and take actions and fail builds and stop that pipeline based off of that. So if you can't go all the way to code review, I think the first logical step on that road is to have some sort of automated, especially for Java, there's good tools to kind of do some level of checking on code quality. So you can start there and move toward that sort of code review and pre-tested commit pipeline. But it's the violations plugin.
You can even fail though if the code formatting doesn't meet your standards.
Well, yeah, I used to work at a Python shop, and that was a completely legitimate reason to fail a build is if the formatting was slightly off. Python developers are like that.
Dude, I'm interested in the audience. How crucial is this code review process to?
For the audience, I'm just interested, how crucial is code review as part of your overall development lifecycle process? Do other people rely on it as heavily as what Tyler's described, or less so?
And we found that, and I'll just, instead of using Mike talk about it, we found that code review really improves the quality of the code that we're doing, but it's by no means part of our normal process. So that's
So you made me think of made me think about a couple weeks ago at Java 1, a Jenkins contributor, Michael Bitterman, actually he wrote a book on agile lifecycle management, ALM, and he gave some really good talks about it. And he comes from the bringing agile into into larger companies. He works in Germany for a large company, if I recall correctly. But integrating with Maven, using Jenkins and other tools in the Java toolkit to kind of get that sort of that agile lifecycle management. It's all foreign to me as a Ruby developer, but a lot of people seemed really interested in what he was doing from that side of things. Application lifecycle management. That's what it was. Is there anything else I can show you guys, talk to you guys about before I come steal all my USB sticks back? That didn't Shoot.
I'm not sure I followed the whole flow of the Garrett-based approval process.
Okay.
So a user makes a change, submits a patch into Garrett, and then at some point a Jenkins build is triggered based on what's in Garrett. What was that? How does that flow work again? And then what happens after that?
First, put everything at the bottom of the screen so no one can see. So, from an individual developer's perspective, I think the framing from start to finish is from doing your work to getting something approved and submitted in Garrett. Well, what that means is that when you do a push to Garrett for that review, a couple of those changes will automatically kick off builds in Jenkins to run whatever tests you configure. And then this is entirely gated based off of other people in your organization signing off on that commit, but also your automated testing signing off on that commit. But pretty much until you hit this upstream repository, everything's on that developer's plate to make sure that it gets there. And then once it's in this upstream repository, then it kind of comes into the more traditional managing of releases and getting code out the door. But by kind of gating everything right here, this is all on that developer to take care of. To where you can't, you could, but you shouldn't be resolving tickets in Jira until something has been approved, or passing them over to QS, for example. Did that answer the question?
So Jenkins has a persistent connection to Garrett. Every time something shows up in Garrett, that launches a Jenkins build for just that change.
Yes.
And then if the tests are successful, then someone else goes and pushes it into an upstream repository? Or is that automated?
I believe you can do an automated integration. I don't think, at least in all the cases I can think of, I don't want to do that. To me, the code review process is 51% of the equation, and the testing is 49%. But what will happen is the Garrett trigger plugin in Jenkins will push a message back to Garrett, to where all the work around that change and getting it integrated is focused in Garrett itself. So you as a developer would have the responsibility of, you would want to come in and add the appropriate reviewers. You can also say, if you're a user, I want to be notified of all commits for this project. So you could be CC'd by default. And then once that's complete, then sort of the focus of those changes moves out of Garrett and into your Gitories repository, and then it's kind of more simple Jenkins from then on.
Just to make sure I understand, like it goes back and forth between Garrett and Jenkins at all times, right? Is that like, so it's not the integration just at one point? It's like originally pushing to Garrett, creating a new branch that's not officially yet. Is that it? And then does that send it off to Jenkins to like, or send it? Yeah, like I guess doesn't jump back and forth a few times.
Yes. Okay. So what will happen is in the stream that gets sent to the Jenkins Garrett trigger plugin, it'll actually receive the Git ref spec for how it can fetch this particular change. And so you would be interacting with Garrett through Git over SSH. Jenkins interacts with Garrett through the SSH stream in one channel, but also through SSH or Git over SSH. And then at the end of that pipeline, or at the end of that process when Jenkins is tested, it'll interact through that SSH API that Garrett offers up. So there's there's a lot of back and forth between the two tools, but it kind of all centers around Garrett and its SSH API and stream.
So you have builds for testing QA and dev, and then you have another build with dev stream for production? Okay.
What you can actually do, and there's another plugin that I wanted to show, but I don't think I can get it together in time. It's called the parameterized trigger plugin. And what it actually allows you to do is invoke other builds as part of your build step, or as a unique build step. So instead of execute shell, you could say invoke run tests as a job name, and you can kind of centralize that logic to a certain extent, to where both the tests that are coming out of this, or building off of this upstream repository, are using that sort of run tests subroutine, and then the Garrett trigger jobs are also using that. So you can repeat a lot, but there are ways with other Jenkins plugins to kind of not repeat yourself and use the same test invocations or the same build scripts or build configurations for these multiple jobs.
Can you describe the relationship between Git and Garrett? It's not clear to me. How does Garrett fit on top of Git, or is it standalone?
So as far as the relationship with Git and Garrett embeds JGit, which is an implementation of the Git protocol in Java. So when Garrett starts up, it'll actually start up a worker thread that just is a Git server. So when you're interacting with it, you are interacting with it just the same way you would interact with GitHub. You can clone from it, you can fetch, you can use all the same sort of Git tooling you're familiar with for utilizing that Garrett repository that's available. Other tools like TeamCity does an interesting thing with subversions where you're not really, to do pre-tested commits, you're not really committing to subversion, you're committing to this TeamCity staging area, and then TeamCity will actually invoke subversion and commit that forward. But the one big powerful aspect of Garrett to me is that it is actually Git underneath the hood. So any other tools that I've got at Lookout that interact with Git already, we can point them at Garrett and get the information you want right out of the box.
In case you don't want to use Garrett anymore, can you access the repos using just the old standard Git tools?
Yeah. I've actually seen projects use Wikimedia does this to where they use actually Wikimedia is an interesting use case for this. They're using Garrett to pre-test and code review their public manifests before they run them into production. But what they've done is, if you want to work with their public manifest, you clone from Garrett. Like, you don't have to buy into the code review whatsoever. You could still use Garrett as a Git repository server if you so choose. And so they use it as that's where the source ends for them, is Garrett and its repository is the ultimate source of source. So you can use it. Anything else? I'm tired of standing up here. So if we wanna finish early, I'm fine with that. Okay. Well, so I've got all of these boxes locally, and I can, if you pull me aside at lunch or really want to see some of this stuff working together, I can show it a lot better on a one-on-one situation. Or if you want the Jenkins boxes, I'll have to post some URLs to those. I'll throw them up on Twitter or something under Camp DevOps. To the pristine Jenkins box that I created and the one with RVM that includes a lot of plugins. And I'll also throw up a link to, I actually use Puppet with Vagrant to create all of those Vagrant boxes. I'll also throw up a link to the actual Puppet manifest for installing Jenkins plugins, and some of the other stuff that I was doing to prepare for this.
What's your GitHub?
Archive.
Archive. So if you go there, we may find all that.
If you go there, there's the Jenkins boxes project, and then there's also the Puppet Jenkins module that I wrote. and some other stuff. So yeah, github.com/archive.
So you have the 2400 meg boxes in there?
No, I just have the. So I started with the Lucid 32 vacant base box,
Okay.
and then Puppet on top of that. Yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you for watching me try to do a demo.
What's your email address again? Do you have that?
Tyler@linux.com.
If you just search Camp DevOps on Twitter, you'll see all this tons of stuff that people are pushing out and all this. So thanks a lot, Tyler. You did a really